Right, grade 12. So I'm just splitting up today's lesson because the sections are a bit long. All right, we're still busy with public sector provisioning. We are now going to do the last two problems with public sector provisioning. And remember again, this is a possible essay question, one of two essay questions in chapter 3. All right, we are now on page 55. The last two reasons or problems with public sector provisioning is the parastatals and then privatization. Right, so what are parastatals? Parastatals or SOEs. SOE stands for state-owned enterprises. Okay? State-owned enterprises. Those are businesses that are owned and controlled by the public sector, but they are run on business principles. In other words, they do have a profit motive. They don't provide goods and services for the greater good of society. They provide goods and services that people have to pay for in order for them to make a profit. All right, now if you have not been living in a cave, you would know that most of the parastatals in the country is in severe financial distress. Okay, all of them are in trouble. All right, so we're going to look today at what are those problems. Now, why are parastatals problematic? All right. Now, parastatals are created in one of two ways, okay? Either the government starts a business, like from scratch, to render a specific service. So the government will start a business where there isn't a business. Or existing businesses can be nationalized. All right. Nationalization means that where the business used to be owned by the private sector, the government will take ownership of those businesses. Then it is nationalization. Right. Now, all of our parastatals in South Africa are businesses that were started by the government from scratch. All right. There's not been any nationalization of any businesses in South Africa. Right. Nationalization, I know, is on the agenda. I know the EFF is in favor of nationalization. Right, nationalization also has challenges. Okay, we can talk about that later. Right, but no business in South Africa at this point have been nationalized. All the state-owned enterprises are owned by the government because the government started those businesses from scratch because there was a gap in the market. Right, now in South Africa, all of our parastatals are classified through the Companies Act as companies with limited liability. And as a company with limited liability, they have to comply with all the accounting requirements of the Companies Act. They are not exempt. Okay? For example, they have to publish their financial statements once a year. They have to be audited as well. Right. There's certain legal requirements for them that they have to comply with. Now, some of the problems of state-owned entities, first of all, is the lack of capacity. Right. Specifically managerial capacity, where these parastatals don't function efficiently because of a lack of skills. Right. Skilled workers prefer to work in the private sector because in the private sector they're able to earn higher salaries. Right. Just to give you an example, in municipalities, there's a small little handful of municipalities that receive clean audits every year when they are audited. The financial management is not always on par. Again, because of the reason that they cannot find qualified accountants to work at municipalities. Remember, if you work in the government, you don't earn as much as what you can if you you do your own thing, right, in the private sector. So any accountant that has studied accountancy and auditing and whatever would much rather go and work for a private firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, whatever, where they are able to earn way more money than what they would be able to earn at a municipality. So when they advertise jobs for financial specialists at municipalities, they find it very difficult to find qualified people that is applying for these positions because people don't want to work for government because they can earn so much more in the private sector. If they are lucky and they do find a qualified accountant, they also find it very difficult to retain them. Obviously, those accountants know that they're super qualified. There's a high demand for accountants. So they find other jobs that pays them more, so they don't stay working there for very, very long. All right. So in many state-owned entities, it's very difficult for them to actually find people to appoint that have the relevant skills and experience that is going to enable them to do their job properly. And again, if you employ a person that does not have the proper skills, obviously he cannot do his job very well. Right. Restructuring also creates challenges. Right. Restructuring means that they are changing their status from being a non-profit seeking operation to a profit-seeking operation. All right. Because now, as a profit-seeking enterprise, as a parastatal, it creates sometimes a problem with service delivery, because now their focus is on making a profit. Their focus is no longer on service delivery. So they can no longer provide services to everybody that needs the service. They can now only provide services to those people who can actually pay for them, because they have to now make a profit. Right. The third problem is that there's limited resources. Now, this is a problem that is faced also in the private sector. It is just simply impossible to provide electricity to everybody, to provide water for everybody, because those are scarce resources. And financial resources is also scarce. Right, there are people in our country, not many, but there are people that don't, for example, have access to sanitation, or they don't have a tap in their house, because it's mostly people that live far away from the urban areas. All right, it costs millions of rands for the government to lay down the pipes and build the water towers and to take the infrastructure there to the more remote areas. Every year in the budget, they do budget a little bit of money for that, and they extend the network. But obviously it's impossible to wave that magic wand and say, okay, right, everybody must now have water. It costs money, and money is a scarce resource for them as well. Right. The last problem is they have exclusive rights that they receive from the government. Most of our parastatals are monopolies. All right. Eskom is a monopoly. It's the only business in our country that is providing electricity, right? Most of these businesses, most of these parastatals are monopolies, or then oligopolies at best. And that leads to higher prices because there's no competition. Eskom, severe financial distress, major problems, right? SAA, major problems. All right. Now, in the case of Eskom, because they are the only one that's a monopoly, there's literally no competition. So if Eskom raises the cost of electricity, we have to pay, right? We have to pay. We can't tell them, no, we're going to switch to your competitor, because there isn't a competitor. And they know this. So they push up their prices way above what it should be, and their service delivery is inefficient. It's not like we can tell Eskom, you're doing load shedding too much, we don't like the service that you deliver, we are going to switch to somewhere else. We have nowhere to switch to. So whether they provide a good service or whether they provide a crappy service, we have to make use of their services. And there's no reason for them to improve what they are doing because they have no competition. All right. Just some examples of parastatals in South Africa. Eskom I've mentioned already. Okay, this list includes parastatals that was created by the South African government. Some of them have been privatized. Right. Eskom is still a parastatal. Iscor and Sasol have been privatized. Now, they used to be parastatals, but they have been privatized. We'll talk about privatization just now. Armscor, okay, the name has changed to Denel. That is still a parastatal. SABC is still a parastatal. Petra SA is still a parastatal. And you can add to that list also SAA. Now, SAA is also a parastatal. Okay. Now, the reason why the government would want to create parastatals, first of all, some of these parastatals was created to decrease our dependency on other countries, like Iscor, for example, right? And Sasol, right? We import oil, South Africa doesn't have any oil. Sasol takes coal and they turn that into fuel. Only Sasol petrol stations in our country is selling fuel that was created by coal. All the other petrol stations, they sell fuel that was made from oil, and oil is imported. Right. So when the previous government started Sasol, the idea was that Sasol needed to grow and we need to create our own fuel. Unfortunately, obviously, Sasol is not big enough to create fuel for everybody, but it does reduce the amount of oil that we import, And it does reduce the dependency that we have on the oil producers. All right, we don't have to buy everything from them. We are able to create some of what we need ourselves. Some of these parastatals were created to ensure infrastructure that would help our economy to be developed. That would be Eskom. Electricity is part of the energy infrastructure that helps our country to run more efficiently. Right. Petro SA, also they take natural gas out of the sea. Right. SABC, it's infrastructure, it's communications infrastructure. It helps our economy with communications and it makes the economy more efficient. Others were created because the government wanted to fulfill some of its obligations to the community, right? So things that they felt was in national interest. It's very important for the country to have. And in some cases, the capital required to establish these businesses was just so big, right? You can think for yourself to build now a competitor for Eskom, to build your own power stations and all the power lines across the whole country. There's no private individual that has that kind of money, right? So private initiative was lacking because no private person had enough money to start businesses of this size. If you look at that list, all of them are huge businesses that took a lot of money to establish. And private people just didn't have that much money. Right, that's your parastatals. Okay. The last problem with public sector provisioning is privatization. Right. Privatization involves the transfer of ownership, control or production from the state, from the government, to the private sector. So privatization basically means that the state is selling their assets, something that they used to own, they are selling into private hands. All right. You'll see there, the first sentence there says, in a broader sense, privatization includes also things like contracting out services, public-private partnerships, PPPs. Okay, we'll discuss that in Module 3. Deregulation, we have referred to deregulation already. Remember, removing laws and regulations that makes competition difficult, for example. Increasing competitiveness for state policies, reducing subsidies or whatever. But basically, the government is transferring their own ownership, their own control to the private sector. Now, an entity is seen as privatized if the government sells more than 50% of the shares of a state-owned enterprise to the private sector, like in the case of Telkom. Right, in the case of Telkom, it used to be state-owned completely. 50% of the shares in Telkom has now been sold to the private sector. So it's what we call semi-privatized. Right. Now, the advantages of privatization. First of all, it does provide the government with extra funds. If I sell my car, the money that I receive for my car is going to be me. It's going to increase my income. So the same for the government, right? If they have a business, if they should privatize Eskom, for example, or when they privatize Telkom, right? When they sold shares in Telkom, the money that people paid for those shares, that was income for the government, right? And the more income they receive in this way, the less income they need to raise in the form of taxes. All right, so potentially they can decrease taxes because they're using privatization to gain some revenue. All right, and any money that they receive through privatization also goes with the tax money into that kitty, and that money can be used to expand infrastructure or pay public servants or to build schools, anything like that. It becomes part of their revenue and they can use that revenue to finance their expenditure. Right. Second advantage, it also broadens the tax base. Right. Very important, state-owned enterprises do not pay companies tax. All right. Remember, any business in South Africa that is a registered business, a separate legal personality, are liable to pay companies tax, corporate income tax on their profits. State-owned enterprises is exempt. They do not have to pay taxes should they make a profit. Right. If they are privatized and they're no longer owned by the government, Now they will have to pay corporate income tax. All right. So it broadens the tax base because now there's more businesses in the country that is liable for corporate income tax. An additional source of tax revenue because businesses that never used to pay taxes before, after privatization, they have to start paying taxes also. All right. The third advantage is that it does increase the efficiency in the economy. All right. State-owned enterprises tends to be a lot less efficient than private sector businesses. Okay. In a private sector, private businesses respond to the demand of consumers. If a consumer feels, if I go to a private hospital, I go to a private hospital and I'm not happy with the service that I receive. Now, I'm not happy with the food they give me. I'm not happy that the nurses come quickly enough when I call them. When I complain, the management is going to listen. Because if I complain and if I'm not happy with the service that I'm receiving there, I am not going to come back and they're not going to make money out of me again. Plus, I'm going to tell all of my friends not to go there because their service is so crap. So they're going to lose a lot of customers in the private sector. In the public sector, if you go to a public hospital and you complain, they don't give a tiny little rat's ass, right? Because if you don't want to come here, then don't. They don't care. Their existence doesn't depend on you being a customer. You are not even paying for the service that you are receiving there. So they don't care about consumer demands. They don't care about the level of service delivery. All right. And because of that, there's a lack of accountability, that feeling of empathy. Remember that they don't care. They don't care about whether the consumer is happy or not. They don't care if they are satisfying your need or not. Apathy, lack of accountability. When these businesses become privatized, now they have to compete. Okay? Now the government's not going to protect them anymore. Now there's competition out there. Now you need to improve your service because otherwise you are going to lose your customers and now you're not going to make a profit anymore. All right. So by privatizing state-owned enterprises, we are exposing them to competition and we are forcing them to become more efficient and to improve their service delivery. Otherwise, they will not survive in the market. The next advantage of privatization is that it can be used to attract foreign investment. This doesn't happen automatically, okay? It can attract foreign investment depending on how the government does the privatization. When, for example, Iskor was privatized, it was sold to a foreigner. Right, it's some wealthy Indian guy. He's Mittal. His surname is something is Mittal. Iskor is now called Mittal Steel. All right. So when they sold Iskor, they didn't sell it to local people. They sold it to a foreigner, which means there was a source of a direct foreign investment coming into the country, which obviously is an inflow, a positive entry on the balance of payments. It's an injection into our economy. And injections are always good. Remember I said it's always better to spend other people's money than our own. This extra money that came into our economy obviously benefited our economy. Right, the next advantage, it lessens the pressure on the government's budget. Okay, at the moment, when Eskom is in trouble, when SAA is in trouble, what do? They cry. They go stand with open hands there by the Minister of Finance and say, oh, I don't have money. Oh, I cannot afford to provide electricity anymore. Oh, and what does the government do? They give them money from the budget. So because our state-owned enterprises are so very, very inefficient, they are supposed to be profitable, but they are not. They're all running at a loss. But because it is in national interest, the government keeps funding them. If Eskom is in trouble, the government bails them out. They give them millions of rands. If SAA is in trouble, they throw a tantrum, the government bails them out. There's a large amount of billions of rands from the budget that is given to these parastatals every single year to keep them afloat. That money could have been used on other stuff. They could have built hospitals. They could have built more schools. But no. They have to bail out the state-owned enterprises. So if we privatize the state-owned enterprises, the government will no longer have to finance them all the time. If they privatize SAA, for example, and SAA comes crying, oh, I need money, the Minister of Finance is going to laugh at them and is going to tell them, you're not my problem anymore. You must make your own money now. All right. So when they privatize, they don't receive allocations from the budget anymore, and the government can either reduce their spending, which will reduce our huge deficit, or they can spend that money in other fields of the economy where there's a big need as well. Right. The last advantage is that it can promote black economic empowerment. Okay, I'm not saying it is automatically doing it. Again, it depends on how they privatize. All right. If they privatize, like in the case of Telkom, okay, with the case of Telkom, when they started selling shares in Telkom, shares was only sold to previously disadvantaged groups initially. All right. So shares was allocated to black people, basically. Then it creates black economic empowerment. All right. There also used to be a state-owned enterprise. It used to be called Aventura Resorts. It's holiday resorts. There's one in Loskop Dam. There's one in Badplaas, I think it was an Aventura. Warm Baths used to be Aventura. It was a holiday resort, a group of holiday resorts that used to be state-owned. When they privatized the Aventura Resorts, it is now called Forever Resorts. Forever Resorts. When it was privatized, they changed the name to Forever Resorts. But Aventura Resorts was sold to a black consortium. All right, so the owners of Forever Resorts is a group of wealthy black businessmen. So that, in a case like that, where privatization was done like that, it does also promote black economic empowerment. Okay, because ownership of black people then increased in the economy. Right, now privatization is not just moonshine and roses. It does have some disadvantages as well. It does cause higher unemployment. All right, in a state-owned enterprise, the government's goal is to create jobs, right? They will sometimes employ 5 people to do a job that one person can totally do, right? But if the business is privatized now, the new owner wants to maximize profits. You cannot maximize profits if you have 5 people sitting there in the office, 4 of them is sitting and doing nothing because it's a one-person job. All right. So the very first thing that happens when a business is privatized, they call it restructuring. Right. It does go hand in hand with retrenchments. The new owner is going to come in. They're going to identify key personnel that is necessary, and everybody else that is in excess is going to be retrenched. All right. This is why the trade unions do not support privatization, because it does mean that some of their members are going to be losing their jobs because the private individual is not going to pay people to sit there and do nothing. All right. They rationalize. Right. Second disadvantage is that when a business is privatized, obviously the business no longer thinks about greater good of the community. Then it only concern become profit maximization. All right. So then the whole motive of the business will change. They are not there to provide goods and services kind of to everybody that needs them anymore. Now they're only going to provide goods and services to those people who can pay for it so that they can maximize their profits. All right. Sometimes costs will also increase, okay, because they want to maximize a profit. So sometimes it does lead to an increase in prices, which means that poorer people might not be able to afford those services anymore. Right. Privatization in South Africa started in the 1980s. Okay, some of the state-owned enterprises that have been privatized, I've mentioned Telkom already. Remember, Telkom was privatized to promote black economic empowerment. Iscor, as I said, ArcelorMittal, okay, that is what it is called now, ArcelorMittal, that was privatized in order to create foreign investment. AXA, that is the Airports Company of South Africa. Right, Sasol should also be on that list. I've also mentioned the Aventura Resorts. Right. Privatization, as I said, was started by the previous government in the 1980s. When Nelson Mandela took over in the 1990s, in 1994, he continued with privatization. Okay, sidebar, Nelson Mandela was an economist. He had an economics degree. He carried on with privatization. When Thabo Mbeki carried on, when he came into power, he carried on with privatization. Again, Thabo Mbeki had a degree in economics. He was an economist. He knew what he was doing, right? When Zuma took over, that is in 2003, the ANC, they changed their mind about privatization. So since 2003, no state-owned enterprises have been privatized since then. All right. Just two definitions. I've already explained privatization. Remember, privatization is when the government takes some of their state-owned enterprises, property of the government, they transfer ownership into private hands. So it's no longer owned by the government, it is now owned by private individuals. Nationalization is the opposite of privatization. Nationalization means that the government takes over ownership from something that used to be owned by private people. And nationalization can be done either with or without compensation. All right. Now, I said already the EFF, Julius Malema, they like nationalization. He's all in favor of nationalization. He's forever saying that we should nationalize the mines, we should nationalize the banks, we should nationalize everything. Okay. As I said, nationalization also have issues. All right. We can chat about that later. Okay. At the moment, what they are talking about is the land, the land, nationalization of the land. And that can be done with or without compensation. It always has been like that. All right. We have always done nationalization with compensation though. All right. But it can be done with or without. Right. Last definition, commercialization or corporatization basically just means that the government transforms their state-owned enterprises into a commercial entity. In other words, they retain ownership. They don't sell their assets. They remain the property of the state, but it is run like a private company and then will also be liable for taxes. All right, so it's still state-owned, but it has a profit motive and they will be liable for taxes. All right, that is the end of this section. So problems with public sector provisioning, as I said, essay question. So this is important. All right.